We're going to get started momentarily here. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We are live streaming the event on Facebook tonight. So if you're not comfortable with your video or name being shown, if you want to keep your camera off, and even feel free to, remove your last name from your Zoom screen name or whatever, it'll only show the speaking person on the feed, but just so you're all aware, that is happening. But otherwise, enjoy the evening, and I'm going to pass it over to Jacob to get us started with the welcome video.
Hi, and welcome to Viewpoints, a public project inspired by conversations held during the Rural Talks to Rural 2020 conference. The purpose of the program is to engage and promote a variety of perspectives on contemporary and global issues through a rural lens. Each session will run between 1 hour and 1 hour and 30 minutes and will be recorded in front of a live audience. The material will then be edited for the CCRC podcast with highlights from the session posted on Instagram. Tonight's episode is called People, Place, and Time: Indigenous Perspectives on Climate. The host is Byron Flekke, who will be joined by First Nation and Indigenous guests from across the planet. A United Nations report on climate said this: "Climate change poses threats and dangers to the survival of our planet, and it is deeply felt in the Indigenous communities worldwide. Even though Indigenous peoples contribute the least to greenhouse emissions. Indigenous peoples are vital to and active in the many ecosystems that inhabit their lands and territories and help enhance the resilience of these ecosystems. In addition, Indigenous peoples interpret and react to the impacts of climate change, drawing on traditional knowledge to find solutions as we try and deal with the climate crisis." Nigerian writer Ben Okri wrote, "Change your story and you might very well change your life." If we can collectively change our story, how might that change positively impact life on the planet? The creative team that helped put Viewpoints together includes Byron Flekke, Lois Anderson, Harveen Sandhu, Bill Dow, Al Lazon, LJ Prabhaharan, Jacob Crosby, Caitlin Peters, and Pete Smith. I'd like to now introduce you to the host of tonight's episode, Byron Flekke.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Byron Flekke. It's good to see everybody today, and good to see all the names and initials where there are no faces. I'm coming to you from what I refer to as occupied Kwantlen territory. And there's something in Canada called the land question. It's a polite way or a euphemistic way of saying some questions need to be answered here, and specifically in BC. And so until the land question is answered, I'll just keep calling it, I think, occupied Kwantlen territory. And so I'm coming from what would be known today as Langley. And something I think that's on a lot of people's mind is news out of what's today known as Saskatchewan from Cowessess First Nation, in a long line and a long history of residential school outcomes. And so part of who I am and how I'm coming to the presentation today is as a Diablo family member out of the community Hawklip. And so I'm Statlium. I'm the first generation of our family and my siblings to not go to the Kamloops school, quote unquote school, and the first to raise our own children. And so as a guest here on Kwantlen's land, I just want to say this is who I am and where I'm coming from, and let people know that trying to come from a good place or a right place while we get into the topic at hand tonight. And so It's good to be here, and it's good to see everybody. And we have some really great guests tonight. And what I plan to do is offer some reflections on people, place, and time, and then really just move out of the way and let our guests talk, and then moderate and maybe ask some questions if we have to. But I feel like it will just take on a life of its own. And the order that we'll go in when I'm done is we will go with Betty Bastian, C. Kapanaki, I believe. Hopefully I didn't get that too wrong. And then Graham Reed is with us, and then Alejandro Argumedo, I believe. And then we'll also play a clip from Tero Mustonen from Finland. And because of the timing and the time zones, it was impossible to have him join us here tonight. So we recorded an interview last week, and we will also be releasing the full interview as its own standalone episode. But tonight, instead of where he would normally be live in the roster, we'll play the clip, and then we'll continue on for some more reflections before I wrap it up with hopefully something witty or nice. And so with that in mind, I'll do my opening sort of spiel, which I hope is just to get some of the juices flowing, or something to reflect on, something to agree with, something to disagree with. We'll see how it goes, but I prepared it here. So people, place, and time, that's the title of the episode. And I think these three things might help frame a conversation on climate and Indigenous perspectives. And I think this because these three things are perhaps the core of our reality. John Trudell, when explaining that we are the human beings, said that the bone, flesh, and blood, the DNA of the human, the bone, flesh, and blood is literally made up of the metals, minerals, and liquids of the earth. So we are parts of the earth, shapes of the earth, forms of the earth. He said that that's the reality. Nothing will ever change that reality. But what does change, and can be changed, sometimes by force, I would add, is our perception of that reality. He phrased it as our perceptual relationship to reality. So how do we perceive our shared reality? And how does that perception relate to climate, or our understanding of climate? And how does that perception allow us to contribute to or influence climate? People, place, and time. Something this has me thinking of, which is also from John Trudell, is that we all have tribal roots. We all come from a tribal past. I think those tribal roots have a lot more in common with each other than we have in common today. The things we have in common around the world today are, I think, more likely related to colonial expansions and imperial ambitions of one flavor or another. So they're forced or coerced similarities. Now, that's a simplification, but I'm going to run with it. I think the further we get from those tribal roots, from that understanding of our relationship to the earth, the more potential we have for disastrous human-made or human-contributed changes in climate. This is not to say that all things related to the climate are 100% the fault of humans. I don't think we're that powerful, but I think there's an awful lot we can control. And once we know better, we should be doing better, unless we are a long way or a long time from our tribal roots. So with people, place, and time in mind, I think it's worth exploring, or at least momentarily thinking about, how memory fits into our reality. Let's consider something like social amnesia. What do we know about our current place and time? And what do we know about the people in it? It is easy to forget our reality when recent perceptions are dressed up in things like progress. Although at times, things seem a little too backwards for me to call them progress. That doesn't stop the argument and the word from being used regularly, but it does help with the forgetting. When you get to control the language, you can control the perception of reality. That being said, I think the bond between people and place over time is too strong to be forgotten easily. This is why Trudell talks about how the people who came over here on a boat had experienced 400 years of this forced perception change. When Trudell says that Columbus was a virus, he means Columbus brought over a perception of reality that was forced on the tribes of Europe, and the disease feeds on the human spirit. So that concept, that understanding of us as the human beings in our shape or form of the earth, was not a part of their worldview anymore. That change was happening for the 20th generation by the time Columbus got here. That change was required to suppress our memories so that progress can take place. And this progress essentially serves what Trudel called the industrial ruling class, or the ethnic rich minority, and what Chomsky would call the people who rule the world. So we have this motivated forgetting, and it's motivated in the most crucial manner for human beings, and that's through survival. So we have a survival-based amnesia. Who can blame anyone for participating in that forgetting? But I don't think it worked. And I think not only are Indigenous peoples' continued existence around the planet an example of that, but I think in the Western civilized world, there are little indicators that the suppressed perception of reality exists. And in those forgotten places of our minds is the true key to our survival as a species. I like to joke with my white friends when they get all outdoorsy. I call it cute. I say, see, she's calling back, she's calling you back, and you just don't realize it. Sometimes people will say it's good for them. They feel better. They get fresh air, exercise. It isn't like being in the city. The list goes on and on and on. And all I can do is say, yes, that's what I said. So with people, place, and time in mind, I'll get out of the way and turn it over to our guests, starting with Betty.
Where is it? Oh, no. Okay, I don't know what's happening. I have no idea what's happening. Peter, is this when I come on? Okay, thank you.
Yes, Betty. Yeah, you do.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, there's my screen. Okay, now. Welcome. Okay, good connection. I welcome you all and greetings in my language. For the time, I'm just going to jump into my presentation. So the people, place, and time theme, I'm going to be speaking about through the lens of Six Gates Itapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy here in Alberta. And the lens that we see people, place, and time is through Atsimmapi. It's the sacred and delicate balance of existence. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is draw you into what our world was like before colonization. And before I do that, I'd like to just honor the children that are found in the graves. And these schools were places where sacred relationships were severed. In our language, we call it ibonitakskua. It's literally the severing of sacred relationships. And it is a form of genocide when you understand that it is the collective soul wound. And it has catastrophic consequences, as you can see in our daily living in Canada, all over the globe. It created an existential crisis for generations. So we find ourselves in an environmental challenge and the possibility of renewal. Through globalization and colonization, they've redefined who we are as human beings. And we've been pacified into complacency. We continue to accept the exploitation and the destruction of our planetary system. We are the most vulnerable, yet we live in deforestation, toxic chemical wastes. We live in a false sense of security. Our identities are that of consumerism for economic growth. The carnage of increasing global warming has produced mass extinctions of our biodiversity. It has brought drought, floods, fires, and recently the pandemic, all causes of a global decline. Language creates worlds, and it distinguishes humanity and embodies practices for existence. At this time, I'd like to quote Black Elk, who said, "You have noticed that everything an Indian does is in a circle, and that is because the power of the world always works in circles." Our humanity is defined as Atsimuikan. It's the unity consciousness with systems for safeguarding structural balance of the universe. Awatsimikatsu is our practices for human existence. It's the participatory responsibilities aligned with the organic world of Siksigate-Sitapi. Unity consciousness is ceremony. Ceremonies are sources of creation. We activate the energy fields of cosmic alliances and natural forces, which contribute to human consciousness. Ceremonies embody the science of the cosmic energy, Ichibatapiyo, source of life, as observed in the vibrations of songs, dance, language, energetic fields of vibrations where co-creation occurs, fields of vibrations where co-creation moves something from the nothingness and alters the physical reality. And we see that in our medicine wheels, the lunar cycles, sweat lodges, teepee designs, the buffalo rock that you see on this slide. Through the unity consciousness, we have our collective responsibilities, and we understand them through ihpipututs. Our humanity is a state of consciousness that merges with the greater world and the cosmos. It's experienced through the alignment with forces and energies of cosmological cycles known to us as our natural alliances. For example, the thunder pipes. The divine nature of our humanity is revealed through reciprocal responsibilities with the greater cosmos. We experience them through dreams, transfers, land-based knowledge, called often sacred sites. Our integrity is essential for planetary sustainability. Our way of life must remain intact. Integrity is centered on our connection to the sacred. Our existence is Atsimmapi, the awareness of the sacred balance of life. Our purpose, Kamutani, participating for the renewal of life. Our structure is Apumutsiyup. Through experience, knowledge is transferred. Our humanity, Astumatup, the embodiment of relational knowledge. Our place is the universe. Our existence is timeless, and our participation is required by the universe. Humanity is the alignment with Ichibatapi, the source of life. Ceremonies are synchronicities with the cycles of creation and renewal. We are timeless. No boundaries, no space. Our homes, the teepee, is the universe, reflecting our unity consciousness. Up here is the stars. On the other side is the Dipper. This is Pleiades. We call it the bunch stars. This is our alliance, our natural alliance, who comes to us in dreams and transfers us gifts for sustainability. Behind here is Morning Star. And the east door opens the new day. We face the sun as it rises. The mountains, the rocks, the valleys. So this is the universe, and that is our home. Our universal alliances are indispensable for global sustainability. The Blackfoot have sustained their world for over 10,000 years, evidenced by carbon dating of the stone flint. These dates predate the Neolithic period of Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. Indigenous science places people at the center of the universe. Their hearts aligned with the wisdom of the ages and connecting to the experiences of sustainability. My last words are to provide you with the thoughts, the teachings of Buwakski. His journey to the sun is the embodiment of Siksikaitsitapi. And he leaves us with this. In the giving of yourself to something greater is the ultimate challenge. And in giving up yourself for the service of humanity, a form of death alters patterns of consciousness. An experience illuminated by revelations of wholeness. That is who we are as human beings, and that's our place in the universe of all of time. That is our understanding. I'll leave you with those thoughts, and thank you very much.
I think we organized this so I might go next, but Chimigwich, Betty, for opening us in such a grounded and important way. It's hard to follow that, and it's hard to think about the way in which that applies to the conversation that we're having today. But I find it's also very simple, and so maybe I'll be able to touch on that. So Anin, Graham Reed, Indigenous Cause, Ottawa, Nunjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dow. I thought it would be useful to follow the introduction and framing of Byron to kind of situate myself through the kind of concepts of people, place, and time to have these conversations that we're having. So I thought I'd start with people. As I alluded to in that very brief introduction, I grew up in Ottawa. My maternal connections are Anishinaabe to the Great Lakes area, and my great-grandfather was born on Okumukong. Just like Byron, and I'm sure many of the folks who have shared the news today in Cowessess and a couple of weeks ago in Kamloops, I think touches very dear to those who live with that intergenerational trauma, and two generations. My Nan's father and grandmother both attended residential school around Manitoulin Island, and want to acknowledge them and the conversation that we're having now. My dad's side is English and Scottish, and as I mentioned, I grew up in Ottawa. In terms of where I am today, I'm on Malahat and Cowichan territory, just north, kind of northwest of Victoria on Vancouver Island. I'm an uninvited guest here, and normally I reside in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver, and have for the last year or so. And I think that centrality of land is so important for the conversation that we're having today. And I hope that, I saw one of you just introduce yourself and where you are in relationship to whose territory you're on. But I think that's a constructive way of situating oneself, especially in the conversation that I think Betty brought up, which is really about how do we regain balance in our relationships with the land around us. So I would definitely encourage you to think about that in the concept of this conversation. And then time. And I thought, it's an interesting time to have these conversations and to think about, the growing recognition of the role of Indigenous peoples within the multiple and intersecting crises that humanity seems to be facing, whether we talk about it in the context of climate and the, I guess, magnified impacts within what we currently call Canada. We know that Canada is subject to warming at double the global magnitude of the world and triple in Canada's Arctic. If the trajectories that are, currently identified in, Western science are accurate, that means Canada's looking at an average of anywhere between 6 and 9 degrees by 2100, which has pretty devastating impacts for who we think about and what we identify as Canadians. So would be important to acknowledge that, but also acknowledge that the fact that Indigenous folks have been talking about this for a long time, and that it's nice that kind of broader society is listening. And I think the first time that I actually met Alejandro was in the context of COP25, which is a part of the annual UN meetings to advance something that many people know, which is the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, state parties made the commitment to maintain global warming under 2.5 or under 2 degrees, and do everything that they can to keep it under 1.5. At that time, Indigenous relatives from around the world were calling for 1 degrees because of the very real and transformative impacts of, what a 1 degree future might look like. And so, it's interesting to think about where we are now and where we're projected to go when we compare that to the conversations that have preceded not only the Paris Agreement, but also the Rio declarations in '92. There are several conferences of Indigenous peoples that occurred before that kind of collective recognition of the concept of sustainability and the creation of those 3 UN bodies. I also think it's relevant for, and it comes back to the really important and grounding points that Betty raised. And it's funny, I can't help but think when Betty, you speak, that you remind me of my grandmother. So thank you for that. But the role that we carry in these spaces. And so, for those who don't know, I've been working at the Assembly of First Nations for the last 5 odd years doing domestic international climate policy work, doing my PhD at Guelph. And I think, one of the opportunities that I see within this space and the work that we do is really embodying the kind of teaching associated with the grass dancer. And this came to a colleague of mine several years ago, talking about it in the context of conservation. And in that context, the teaching of the grass dancer was shared about what is the role of the grass dancer in creating that space for ceremony to happen, and how can we think about the role that we're doing and the foundational requirements to open up that space for nations to enter. Many nations who are still navigating the current legacy of the project of colonization, and we see that it rears its ugly head every single day in the lives of Indigenous peoples. And so I guess it's important to think about how do we make sure that that space for ceremony is appropriate and is grounded in the tenets of different knowledge systems. Betty introduced one, Anishinaabe, we talk about in the 7 grandfather teachings, and using that as guiding principles to open up that space. But I think part of that is also how do we think about that? And so what I want to put into the virtual circle is the concept that we're working on around the First Nations climate lens. And when we think about, how do we reframe climate conversations away from the overemphasis on reducing GHGs towards a lens through which we look at, those root cause problems that I think Byron really introduced well in the opening remarks. And the way in which we're conceptualizing this is kind of 4 concentric circles. The first concentric circle is that natural law that was articulated very eloquently. The second is really the acknowledgement of the legislative, policy, and regulatory context in which Indigenous peoples operate, not only based on the confines of colonial legislation like the India Act, but also the now royally proclaimed legislation on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls for justice from the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the kind of litany of Supreme Court cases that have affirmed Indigenous rights, even though the model of recognition by the Crown is not sufficient to recognize those inherent rights that stem from the Creator. The next circle that we talk about is this notion of First Nations lived reality, and that's really about how are we embedding the appropriate power and equity considerations in an analysis of climate. How do we really think about climate as fundamentally interlinked with all of the other things that we seem to talk about in the media, whether it's clean drinking water, whether it's a shortage of housing on reserve, whether it's inequitable dollar provisions for education, all of which are really important when thinking about that climate sphere. And the final circle really, I think, gets back to the really important contribution that Betty provided about that grounding in First Nations worldviews. And I see this as a recognition that Indigenous knowledge systems or First Nations knowledge systems embody not only knowledge, right? They embody values, legal orders, and governance, all of which are foundational to the appropriate consideration in their role of the co-production of knowledge, or the co-decision making that really acknowledges and uplifts the role of Indigenous nations in what we now call as Canada. And I think, together, the notion of those 4 concentric circles is really about bringing into focus what are the solutions required to foundationally address and reframe the conversation in a way that acknowledges the relational dimension, political dimension, and sociocultural dimension of the problem that we're talking about today. And so I hope that through the space that we're creating, we can start to think about this differently and start to think about it in a way that, really sees the interconnections of that project of decolonization and that project of decarbonization. And how do we do those things simultaneously in a way that also uplifts the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples. And I thought I'd close with, the reframing associated with that lens and the work that we're doing really, first begins to kind of reassert the gaze of the problems associated with climate and biodiversity to their root causes. How do we talk about colonialism and the extractive tendencies of capitalism, whether for the land, for women, for people, all of which are kind of root causes? How do we think about the overemphasis on carbon as the main goal? And look, Atlas is excited about it. And how do we get to the place where we start to conceptualize climate solutions as language revitalization and cultural revitalization, and really getting back to that role of balance and renewal that Betty spoke about? And I think, just to close, that by doing that, we really shift this conversation away from tenets baked within scarcity and competition and accumulation towards those embedded within abundance and cooperation and relationality. And really, we then get to the space where we're talking about people, land, and reciprocity, or as Byron framed it, people, place, and time. And I think that's an exciting place to be. So Chimingwich for that opportunity, and look forward to our conversations.
So Jacob, you can play the video now, and welcome Changeant Circle.
Llaqtachaymantas wiltaramusqani, wasichaymantas puriramuni. Pachamamama paguta ruwaspa, apukunaman nuqamañamusaq. Kay karu llaqtapi qantiyanakipaq, kay karu llaqtapi qantiyanakipaq. Imanispataq kutirapusaqri, hayk'anispataq kutirapusaqri. Kay karu llaqtaman papachayta saqi, kay karu llaqtaman papachay pasampun. Imanispataq kutirapusaqri, hayk'anispataq kutirapusaqri. Kay karu llaqtaman papachayta saqi, kay karu llaqtaman papachay pasampun. Pachamamama paguta ruwaspa, apukunaman nuqamañamusaq. Kay karu llaqtapi qantiyanakipaq, imanispataq kutirapusaq, hayk'anispataq kutirapusaq.
El Parque de la Papa es una asociación de 5 comunidades indígenas o andinas. Es una área de conservación de agrobiodiversidad de papas nativas, pues también ahí se está conservándose todo nuestro conocimiento tradicional y todas nuestras culturas vivas, y también llamado como un patrimonio biocultural e indígena. Es un paisaje cultural, ¿no?
¿Por qué un parque de la papa? No es solamente mantener una gran diversidad genética, pero también la historia de nuestro pueblo. Esta coevolución entre los quechuas y la papa nativa hace posible que nuevas expresiones genéticas puedan surgir y que estas otras que existen puedan seguir adaptándose a estos cambios que en los Andes se ven y que son dramáticos. El cambio climático no es un fenómeno simple, se necesita ver cómo se puede crear la alimentación del futuro. Pensamos hacer este viaje a Svalbard, donde una comisión del Parque de la Papa llevará las semillas, porque esto no se puede responder solos.
Pachamunasqay saqiyapushani.
preserve the seeds here is that we want them to serve the farmers in the future. Get back to that, to face the challenge that we have in the future. For FAO, this is what matters. Bring farmers and scientists together to preserve biodiversity for future generations, use them in their benefit.
It's 120 meters now from the entrance and until we enter the mountain. Then we go through a tunnel which is also outside the mountain, and then we enter the mountain and enter a door and come into where it's -6 degrees all year around because of the permafrost. So let's go. Let's go.
Most important that is having the farmers here bringing potato. Potato is one of the 5 big crops in the world that feed around 75–80% of the population nowadays. In situ preservation, what you do, the new varieties that you have been growing, up to 5,000. This is really part of the challenge that we have for the future, have those varieties available to be used in the future. To use those genes for bring resistance to other possible varieties. We thank you.
I've been talking to my colleagues here, and we have very strong and mixed emotions. This for us is a true spiritual journey. The potato's history goes back to the beginning of time for us. All our culture have evolved or co-evolved with the potato. We are potato people. We have it when we are born, when we get married, when we get baptized, and they grow very close to us, that they are part of the family. And we've been talking about how this part of us, this family of us, is going to stay here. And there are our mixed emotions, because we are not just living genes or tribes, but also a family.
Mama Kocha, kay yaktapi sumakta kang kawarinki, kay tukuy mukukunata, kay pawinyay kunah mihunampa, kay montaña kaska sumakriti mama, kanya sumakta kuidanki, wakaychanki kay mukunchis kunata. Peru suyupi, ausangati, pitusiray, hatun nukayko kanki yanapahni apuyko, kanya munayta keita uywanki kawarimunki. Kunanka makikiman hapichikiko kay mukuykuta nukaykupah, mihunaykupah kepawawakunaq mihunanpah, hina qhipanmantaq mundundin runakunaman mihuchinaykipaq. Chirayku nukayku keita aparikiko, kaywan tukurikamuykiko tukuy sunquykuman.
Llaqtachallaymantas nuqaqa murani, wasichallaymantas nuqaqa murani, waqachallayqipisqa ispanqa llaqtan, waqachallayqipisqa
Thank you very much. I would like to make a couple of comments in relation to this video, which captures this journey that my brothers and sisters from the Potato Park took, taking around 900 seeds from the collection that the Potato Park has in Cusco, which amounts to around 1,400 varieties. In the whole region, we have around 5,000 varieties of potatoes. So diversity is one of our characteristics. The video itself was built around a zone, as you've seen it, that our sister Brisaida composed on the spot, which captured her feelings, the feelings that she was experiencing that moment in terms of place, where she was up in the Arctic, and drawing this connection with our ancestors back in the Andes, where we revere the mountains. Mountains are sacred, but also mountains play a role. For instance, in the Potato Park, mountains are elected as authorities, and they have to fulfill their duties in terms of providing water, in terms of providing pasture, medicinal plants, are taking care for people in this world where the realm of people, the realm of the sacred, and the realm of the wild, which humans do not control, have to live in community. And here, what I would like to underline in terms of this conversation is the fact that this worldview, which is holistic, non-anthropocentric, tell us one of the things that, in my opinion, has caused most of the problems, or all the problems we face with these multiple crises that people, my brother and sister that spoke before have referred to, which is this idea of human exceptionalism. We think that humans are up top in this pyramid of evolution. And of course, certain kinds of humans are why at the top. And this conception, this framework creates this idea also of white supremacy, because certain kinds of people are superior to other peoples. And then, the rest of other species are inferior. So they became non-related. They became, materials to be exploited, natural resources, as we call it. And this is very, I think, very problematic. And this video tells us that that type of conception does imply in the communities and many indigenous peoples where all relations, the concept of relationality and closeness, familiarity continues to play. And the current pandemic also makes us reflect where a virus has just, put us in confinement, a little thing that's more intelligent than humans, that easily can mutate, change, and keep us in our boxes, because we think that with technology, with science, we can dominate them. And I think we are wrong, because we have crossed the line, have transited, have modified many things that we are just paying the consequences. And probably we're walking into an era of many crises that are going to be continued. Climate change is a reality. You know, the species extinction, the disparity in society that otherwise we dreamed will end continues to be widening. And all that, you know, also, in my opinion, brings this other thing that this video tries to touch upon, which is complexity and how Indigenous peoples understand the world as a complex system and adapt to it, recognizing that the other aspects of the relationality they have need to be respected in order to have a balance through a reciprocal relationship. So that also, I think there's other aspects of it, which is the sovereignty in terms of food systems, in terms of the rights to keep our own culture, the right to maintain our own type of seeds and different ways of cooking and using plants and food and just sharing it, which is something that we have lost because now we depend on an industrial system that only provides highly processed food, which also is part of this big problem. So in exercising this sovereignty, the Potato Park communities exercise a sovereignty which is relational. It's local and, as you see, international, because mountains in Svalbard are also relatives to the mountains in Peru, but by being recognized mountain to mountain and people to people, there is some certain type of sovereignty that people acquire, and that's what matters in terms of their own spiritual and material health and well-being. So we have been working with this idea or this concept of relational sovereignty to see where we can accept sovereign rights in different scales. And this is an example of this. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all three of you. That was really beautiful. We're going to load up now the video of a section of the interview with Tero Mustonen. If you don't know who he is, you can go to the website snowchange.org and take a look there. It's pretty cool. That's just one of the many things that Tero's involved in, and a few sort of reflections just off the top of my head here while we were listening to these guests was the role that language plays, the power language has, who uses it, how they use it, the different sort of worldviews, and how one involves sort of responsibility and a necessary participation with the responsibility, and the other involves resources to be used, including human beings. And so I think some of the things have been really great, like with Graham's mentioning about reasserting the lens or changing the lens. I think if we let somebody else control the framework, then we're already limited to our responses because they're going to necessarily be a part of that framework and can't step outside of them. And for what we might call, say, something like a capitalist system, which maybe I'll get in trouble, but maybe I won't. The world existed before that. And so it is possible to step outside of the lens and sort of think, and so to change the viewpoint from it. And so we will put the video up now. And for the other guests, Taro sort of anticipated one of my challenging questions that I was going to ask. And so it comes up when I bring up the short novel, I Am Legend. And so feel free to respond to that challenge or any of it that Taro brings up, because it's all quite beautiful. And so once the video is over, Betty, you could unmute and turn your camera on to respond if you like. Thank you, everyone.
It's just so different, and the way history went in different places, and it takes so much effort to think you can't speak your own language. So I think we are blessed in that sense, despite the ecological damage that has happened in Finland, that our post-ice age language is still here, and it's often been cited as being one of the hunter-gatherer languages of northeastern Eurasia. So there's this group of languages called Finno-Ugric peoples, the Sami, the Komi, Hanti, Finns, Estonians. My takeaway from that reflection is that the sense of reality is being dictated, and also the sense of time and the past, present, and those futures to come that are trapped in that line of progress. The second thing that came to my mind was the necessities of social change in places like Canada. You are one of the strongest in the world in terms of a public society, by respecting multiple viewpoints, by bringing critical voices, discourses, narratives, and so on and so on. You believe that change will happen. I'm rather skeptical. I think that sometimes that is it too late? Is the damage is too big? For example, if the conceptualization of time and space can't happen using literally, let me put it other way, in ways that are fluent in indigenous languages. And this is, of course, not a way to ignore the damage to the indigenous societies. The damage is horrible, and it's a catastrophe that so many of the languages are either critically endangered or have already died out. But it's still there, that only by fluently knowing the language and the deeper layers of the mind that's embedded in a boreal or northern linguistic reality and social reality, you can come to the nuances. And those are really the key in many places here on how we call, for example, certain fish or certain fish that might predict things to come, have their specific names and cultural indicators, and if I start to explain them in English, they might be descriptive and to the point, and they might describe the northern pike that's really specific, or we can use her liver to predict the seasonal weather, but it doesn't really convey the how things are. It will describe it, but it doesn't convey the essential word that we use for that liver or northern pike or the fish. And that's the double loss, double disassociation that came to my mind. That how do you undo that? Of course, the healing and the rebuilding starts what you said, which is that we name how things are, we name the colonial attack and the genocide and so on. But are we in a place, or traditional societies and indigenous peoples, the work to be done to come to a place of rebuilding those cultural realities is immense. There's only a handful of places in the world where I have ever seen it succeeding. And we should be aware of that challenge. That's some of the thoughts that came to me.
That was really beautiful. I think the nuances and the language, kind of what we actually lose in translation, is a pretty important topic, especially as it relates to climate and our understanding of it and our relationship to it. Something you mentioned, I had an outro question planned, which I'll jump to now because you sort of brought it up with your skepticism, is that one of my favorite short novels is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And in it, you know, he's fighting these vampires and they've taken over the world, and a new sort of hybrid species arises, and he's the last of the regular human beings. And he's been sort of laying waste to the vampires while they've been trying to come for him. And at the very end, you know, they've somebody's tried to help him by getting him to escape, and he refuses to leave his home. And that's sort of what does him in, is his paranoia and his refusal to leave his home. The stubbornness, the same kind of stubbornness that human beings are really good at having. And in the sort of closing moments, as he's on his way to his very public execution, he realizes that he's a part of the old ways, and he is legend now. And so some of the things I wonder when we look at what we've done to the planet and each other is it too late? Are we just Robert Neville sitting alone in our house refusing to leave as the new world sort of peeks around the corner? And then should we just, similar to, I guess, Socrates, take our medicine and then become the stuff of the legends of the future? And maybe there's a new human species that will come out of our coming sort of climate catastrophes. So that's one of my sort of negative ones, where I would throw it out as a challenge and maybe ask if you think there's any, I guess, first of all, if there's any hope, but also if humans deserve to continue on or just become legend. And I think I'm not pessimistic. I just put it out to highlight or motivate why people should seriously consider some of these topics. And so, you have any thoughts on taking our medicine and moving on, or continuing to fight the good fight, so to speak?
Well, if there is a fight and if there are things to be done, they should be based on the utmost and sugared sense of reality to the extent we can. So the first thing we should admit, whether it's Canada or Finland, is that how much and how deep the damages go. Nothing can happen before we have that self-reflection and say that if I think of, for example, our case, 90% of the primary boreal forest in Finland over the past 75 years has been handed over to the timber industries and the pulp mills, much like most of boreal Canada. The difficulty with what you are describing and what's so central to the First Nations and Inuit struggles in Canada are these rhetorical expressions on indigenous knowledge and associated rights and rebuilding and so on and so on. The difficulty with those things in any culture, whether it's Bangladesh or Finland or Canada, is that, for example, in our case, the thoughts and the deep things that exist in any culture, or as a basis core of any culture, can only be found in the undisturbed or natural systems. In our case, of course, the boreal forest. This would be the home, the source, the center of all of our creativity, our own names for the stars, our name for the fishing gear, or how a woman might think about their life, or a painter might do whatever they do. Or we used to have these birch bark dances, or dances associated with birch bark masks, at the time of the old religion, to honor some of the forest beings and so on and so on. Now, what I'm trying to say is that if you remove those central 90% elements of that reality by clear cutting those forests and ditching peatlands and altering river systems that are interconnected with the forest, you are clear cutting the mind. And therefore, our starting point, if in our case, if we have lost over 90% of our boreal forests in Finland, it implies that we have then lost over 95% of our so-called traditional mind. And the generation who is alive today, for example, myself, born in 1970s, can hope to grasp or come to an understanding of, in my lifetime, at its best, about 3 to 5% of what reality consisted of to the old people. And that's our starting point. How do you rebuild from that 3% when you know that 100 years ago or 200 years ago in our region, for example, in North Karelia, there was a whole boreal civilization of unbroken epic songs, oral histories that were then documented by Lönnrot and used by Tolkien, for example, as the basis of the Elven languages in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I once gave a keynote at University of Leeds, where Tolkien had been a professor before the time at Oxford, and I jokingly started by saying that I'm here to collect some royalties because you took our songs and so on and so on. They didn't find it too funny, but in any case, the point being is that we know the past existed. We know that the traditional society was genuine. It wasn't some noble savage or fairy tale society. It was a human society. There was a lot of trouble, a lot of bad times, misuse of this and that. It was a human society. But one of your Inuit filmmakers, Elisabeth Illepi, has said very beautifully about the past of any traditional society that the difference between today and the past is that it was their time. They were in the position of making that justice system, or making a call when to go hunting, or they decided when they get married or when they expel a person, or so on and so on. And today that reality is controlled by invisible and visible forces in a degraded landscape of those 3% of natural ecosystems remaining. And that's in a way the strategic starting point when you talk about cultural revitalization. So try to answer in summary, very short, to your very important question. I think we will become new. There's no going back to anything that used to be 200 years ago. We have to embrace the fact that the landscapes are now different. We have to embrace that a lot of indigenous and traditional communities are operating in many cases in English or in a degraded capacity to maintain their languages. But there is still things to be done to be free. So the concept of freedom is still there. And no matter how many residential schools or prisons or genocides have happened, if there's a people, they can still be free. And that's what we should be striving for. So there are still universal forces, for the lack of better term, the seen and the unseen, which have never left us. They are still here, despite the fact that the attack on the mind in traditional societies has been so severe by the colonial forces. Sometimes we become the enemy, like the Finns. We can self-colonize. We can become our own worst enemy. It doesn't always have to be the Soviets or the Canada or the US. It's us. Let's start from that. What happened with my father or their grandparents? So we can also be in a position of self-harm by having thrown down the values and senses of reality in the past generations, and also the abuse, alcoholism, and suicide, and whatever the case, because we chose to. we don't often like to talk about this, but this is also the case that there's a tremendous damages that have taken place because men mostly have embraced really bad ideas and practices. Maybe some of the ladies had it better, but they are now paying the price of our mistakes. But to cut the rambles short, I think the rebuilding really has to go hand in hand with nurturing large-scale ecosystems back into health. At least that's the only solution that I have found over my 20 years in the Arctic and Northern societies, where we in Snow Change have instigated a program called Landscape Rewilding. That's very much about reality and senses of reality, where we, by working on the created landscapes and using something we call rewilding, we are able to recreate safe havens for that mind to take a rest, rebuild, and coexist with the ancient forest. Granted, these are pennies, these are small sites, but they do exist. And in many ways, they are like monasteries in the Middle Ages in Europe. They are safeguarding something that's still there, even though it has been so much destroyed elsewhere.
With the rewilding efforts, are there noticeable changes outside of the area that the rewilding is taking place? Like, are you able to see a measurable difference in the immediate vicinity? And then I guess it would get lesser as it goes out, as the rest sort of encroaches back in on it. But I think the way that I would frame it is as the rewilding encroaches on everything else. But are you able to sort of see that and measure that?
That's a very good question. Rewilding often can also be linked with restoration, so you can change these terms, but I'm just using rewilding for the sake of putting the emphasis on trusting natural cycles and succession of, for example, forest or peatlands to come back on their own terms. I guess there are two observations that might be of relevance. On some of our sites where we have been working on, the physical comeback of biodiversity has been astounding. For example, there was a peatland that had 2 bird species when the mining of peat was going on. And then now it's the home of 195 bird species today after a few years. So these are not trifles, some magical or some made up metrics. This is hard data from biologists in these stations that have monitored chick reproduction, how many birds come forwards, what kind of species have come back, and extremely rare waders and other species, as well as comebacks in numbers, with 25,000 geese landing there on their autumn migrations. And then the offshoot, which is your question really, has come to play. On the human realm, by demonstrating that use of indigenous and scientific knowledge in rewilding has made a comeback for many of these sites in our programs, it has led many, shall we say, new visitors to these sites, including our village school. One of the duck species that comes to our village now onto these rewilded sites is a smew in English, S-M-E-W. And it's a beautiful duck species. And at first the kids these are elementary school children, so they would be learning about smew in a book or maybe online Wikipedia, and they would paint smew in a watercolor. And then on the next day, they would go on to this site and actually using binoculars and others, they would see the smew for the first time in their lives and realize what they saw in theory to become reality for them, and how this wonderful bird might be there. So there's some radiating or cascading social reality that attracts then more families, more visitors, up to 1,000 people now that come to these sites in a year. That's whether they consciously may not think that, but they are renewing their connections to these birds. They are enjoying these landscapes and, for the lack of better term, cleansing themselves of the past things. The second thing is that the cascading impact of a rewilding site can happen also on biological terms. So having strong centers that are, again, in the hands of nature will have spillover effects so that many nesting birds come to neighboring river systems, ponds. We have seen the comeback of mammals, wolverines, otter, pollinators, frog species and lizards and so on and so on. And these are kind of the cascading impacts of restoring a land that still, despite its degradation, retains something. And it's really by tapping into that something that I don't want to name because it's not to be named today, but it's often unseen and it can be worked with if you have traditional knowledge co-researchers who can, for example, speak with those kind of elements of nature, the unseen, and also listen what's being said by a site or a place or being that resides in a place, that we can then truly see the cascading benefits, where we understand that despite the damages that humans have caused, for example, on a forest or peatland, if you have the right traditional owners and science working hand in hand, beautiful things can come to light. I never believed we could have a site that traps 1 million kilos of carbon a year because of our rewilding, or 195 bird species that are now constant feature of our village. And those are the powerful testimonies, some of which have been published in peer-reviewed science, to talk about the skeptics, or to the skeptics, because we have to be also extremely honest. We can't say any more about only about the rhetorics or, oh, everything will be better, or it will all go to hell. I don't personally believe either. I think the future is not set. There's a third way to be done. We just have to embrace it.
Okay, so we'll go to Betty now, and Bill left a question in the chat, Betty, about the word that you had mentioned before about we seek balance, and if you wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's awatsimishkatsup was the word that speaks to we seek balance. See, we understand that the world is interdependent, interconnected, and there's the cycles speak to the reciprocity, and it focuses on our participation in regards to this organic world. So what we do in terms of our in terms of who we are, and it's like the big picture, the big picture is that our cultures is all centered around this notion of seeking balance. Our daily traditions in terms of how we treat each other, the protocols in terms of how you are with the different genders and how you relate in a family, how the home is organized. It just speaks to that whole notion of through the ages, our ancestors understood these were the ways that we maintain balance, that we maintain good relations. And so it's just all who we are in our culture. I don't know if that answers the question, but and of course, what I spoke about today was the ceremonies, which are central to all of that. And we continue to renew those good relations, seeking balance. And when we offend somebody, we know how to correct it. And we also know that it's not about us, it's about the world in which we live. It's for the continuity of our our world, and we're not separate from, as today we continue these ceremonies that continue to renew those relationships. And as the previous speaker spoke, they're so limited, and he really challenges the idea of really, are we able to rebuild these indigenous cultures? And can we, in Canada, there's 53 distinct languages, and 50 of them will be extinct. So that gives us a context for the continued extinction of not only the biodiversity, but for the different lenses in which we need to sustain ourselves as human beings.
And I think that ties in really well for me with how the language sort of comes about, and how it's a part of each culture and the role that the language plays. And as a language goes extinct and the people don't, then that adds some more, we have more questions and more troubling questions to explore. And there's a book that came out recently by Russell Jacoby called On Diversity. And a section of that is about how somehow the English language just took over the planet. And I call it sort of a galactic basic. And somehow that has taken over. And how does that interact, or when did that language first come to our land? And so I'm not sure about other people's history, but the first European person in our territory was Simon Fraser. So it's pretty recent. And then I think it was another 30 or 40 years before another person kind of wandered in, lost and cold and unprepared for the elements. But I think that those languages tied into those worldviews really highlights for us how Alejandro's clip showed the connection to, as was mentioned in the clip, we were potato people, and giving us a bit of a peek at that viewpoint and that worldview and that understanding. And then similar to Betty, yours, and how it's part of our responsibility and part of this cosmos, as you mentioned previously. And then when we look at how the language came to our land, and it was this sort of individualistic worldview and a dominance worldview where you could just name a thing and have control over it. And you were sort of in charge of everything because you're the exceptional being instead of a part of the overall being of the cosmos. So thank you. That was it's good. It's got me thinking, and I love it, and so I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Graham, would you like to comment or respond to anything?
Yeah, lots to think about, and one of the points that Bill talked about, I guess, was the interconnection between all that was shared, and I really liked the kind of relational sovereignty concept that Alejandro kind of shared, because it also, in my mind, speaks to the point that Taro raised about the kind of notion and very visual impact of clear cutting the mind, and what that means for the connection that you and Betty just shared about the revitalization of language. And that's partly why I think I raised that as a solution. And I hope that in this conversation there was almost zero talk about renewable energy, a talk about EV cars, talking about solar panels. And I think that really kind of illustrates how we approach these things differently. And I think it's an important framing for you, Byron, just kind of framing the overarching conversation around people, place, and time. And it reminds me of two things, and maybe I'll close with this. So last year, the AFN hosted a national climate gathering in Whitehorse, and we had a keynote speaker from Old Crow, Yukon, from Vantakwichin territory, Chief Dana Teja Tram. And among everything else, he kind of walked us through the last 500 years of history within 30 minutes, kind of deconstructing all of the like assumptions that are found within, modern economics. And Byron, as you said, kind of the approach that found its way, and not only found its way, but violently imposed its way on, the people that were here. And it's not just, I don't think it's an accident that we're all talking English right now. It was active and designed. And I think if anything, that's what we saw today in Cowasis and otherwise. But what Chief Dana said through that process was really kind of reframing climate as not a kind of standalone issue, but really a people problem. And I think in this context, it really drives home why we're talking about these things and why all of those different presentations were so interrelated and focused on the role that we have individually, and not only individually. An auntie of mine talks about these concentric circles. So the role that we have individually, the role that we have within our families, our communities, and our nations. And I think that there's an opportunity following this conversation to think about how do you make those impacts within those cascading roles of influence that all of you have. But it also speaks to your question from I Am Legend. Is it too late? And I think that's an interesting question, and something that when you work in this space, you feel pretty existential pretty regularly. And I'm always reminded, actually, this is some tobacco from another Vantakwichan elder who the Vantakwichan have been fighting for the protection of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, to protect the sacred calving grounds of the porcupine caribou. And we're talking about a community of 300 fighting, international multilateral oil companies, and have successfully defended that. And Lorraine, which is the elder that always that gave this to me and always tells me that, is that she has hope because there's no other possible way that she can approach these problems. And so I think, like, in the context of is it too late, I don't think there's an option to say yes. Are there substantial changes that are foundational and probably problematic? Absolutely. But if anything, I think the indication is that our people have adapted over thousands and thousands of years and continue to adapt. And so I maybe leave that with everybody in the role that we can all go moving forward. And part of what I think gets to that supporting of that adaptation is really eliminating all the structural barriers to the way in which we can adapt. We used to adapt as Anishinaabe folks through seasonal mobility, and many Indigenous folks had different camps, didn't have permanent settlements, and now we're stuck in that because of the Indian Act, right? And so our processes of adaptation have been limited. And, so I think part of what we can do is also see that kind of deshackling of the colonization project as kind of simultaneous to, the work of rebuilding our nations and reinvesting in our language and our cultures. And so hopefully that's something that everybody listening can get involved and help do, because it does take everybody, and it really starts from truth. And so Chimigwech for this space and for organizing it, and really insightful conversations.
Thank you very much. Kind of I guess adding on to that, when you point out what doesn't come up in the conversation for the night, I think that's really important, and I think it's awesome that you pointed that out. And I think similar to that is the lens that we're looking at it from is obviously different from the lens that people would like everyone to look at it from, or the lens that's imposed on people. And so as I turn it over here to Alejandro, something that I had thought of was how completely different our universes or our cosmos are, where I go to the store in Langley and I pick up a bag of potatoes, and I have one of three options, and I don't have that relationship. I'll have a similar relationship with something else, but it's not that one. And how completely different my viewpoint is, informed by me living on the land instead of with it, here in someone else's territory, is different to this other viewpoint. And how, in a previous conversation with Taro, I learned that our 1 degree here in Western Canada, where it's quite comfortable, life is really comfortable here, our 1 degree is about 4 degrees for him. And that's a much bigger problem than the framing that I get from my media and that's fed to me on a regular basis. And so I'll go to Alejandro for some closing remarks there, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Byron. I was thinking on Taro's reflections, and I find them profound, but also challengeable, because I think there's this assumption that traditional is the past. So that we are not going to be the past, obviously. We're never going to be the past, but we're going to be the future with the past. So in this circle of rewinding, like he puts, we will recover that 90% of clear cut of the mind. It won't be like the past, because time and space is in a spiral. We're still in the circle, but not in the same water, because the river flows. The water may come back with the rain, but it will be a different time, maybe a different season. So I believe that diversity extends to epistemic diversity. And while, of course, we need to demonstrate certain facts, it doesn't have to be science. We don't have to use the metrics of science to make us believe that what we have achieved with 160 birds is real. Because for some elders, many of those birds may be spirits, or maybe just souls that have come back. So we have to respect this epistemic diversity and the different types of literacy that we have. And that's what makes humans what we are, rich in our expressions, in the use of the language, and the different ways we can mix things, carve, paint, create, recreate. And that goes with potatoes. And what we do, we recreate all those colors, shapes, textures, flavors, smell in the potato, because it's something that was close. And we go evolve it like a family. So in other locations, in other places, there will be different things. For there will be this boreal forest and the birds. For you would be perhaps, a totally different realm. So those dimensions, I think, needs to be respected. Diversity is key, and diversity, respecting diversity, I think, is what makes us flourish, because we also will respect all relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the sort of closing remarks, I wanted to throw out a challenge, or I wasn't sure what to do. And then I thought I would rather have a more positive message overall, because I think the challenge was already put on the table with the I am legend part, and was responded to. And so I think one of the things Taro mentioned in his clip was if there's a people that they can be free. And I think I would add on with some of the thoughts and responses and everything that we've had tonight, that if there's a people, they can be free and they can also dream. And Taro said in a different part of the interview that we just have to imagine what the future still could be. And so I think we can dream better and imagine better. And then I guess the hard part is just making it happen. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks so much to Byron and his guests for taking the time to offer their valuable insights and for creating the conversation for tonight's broadcast. We'd also like to thank you for tuning in, and we'd like to invite you back to our next Viewpoints on Thursday, July 22nd. It will be on immigration and climate change. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback on what you've heard, drop us a line at info@ruralcreativity.ca. On behalf of all of us at the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, stay safe, be kind to each other and to the earth, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.